I was electrocuted by about 13,800 volts. The doctors say that it was likely the first hit that stopped my heart and the second one that started it again, before I was pulled like a lifeless corpse to safety. I remember experiencing the darkest of dark and the most silent silence. I ceased to care that I was dying. Time seemed to change. It could have been hours, it seemed, but it was only about 30 seconds. I felt as though I was floating and floated towards something that I eventually realized was my body and reality again. Upon joining with whatever I was floating towards, I became self-aware in my body and heard the electricity making horrible noises, and I knew I was in danger. From there, it was a horribly painful experience where I lost most of my toes due to tissue death and had severe electrical burns on all 4 of my limbs. With more surgeries than I care to count, and seeing the round bone ends of my toes that were freshly amputated, it still haunts me a little. I was inpatient at the hospital for about a month, and then for another 10 months daily as an outpatient, because they sent me home for my mental sanity, but I still needed daily attention. I got addicted to painkillers, and I had to learn to walk again and had to see a pain management therapist. It was horrible at times, but eventually the pain began to subside. I went back to school and became an engineer, and I don't think I'd be where I am today without this thing happening. It's really strange to think that I'm somewhat grateful now. Also, I can't watch horror anymore. Hollywood actually does a very realistic job. I was 6 to 7 years old, and one day I got rushed to the hospital by my parents because they heard me breathing really loud and hard. The very last thing I remembered were faces of the doctors and nurses above me while I was lying on my back, and then I flatlined. The weirdest, most unexplainable thing happened to me then and there. I suddenly could see the whole scene as a spectator, like I was a floating spirit in that room. I could see myself getting revived, I saw my mom crying, and I saw my dad trying to comfort her. Then I saw a white entity shaped like my body, falling through the ceiling and slowly, like a leaf on the wind, falling down to eventually land inside my body. And that's when the experience ended. I was put into a medically induced coma, and I woke up after some days. I don't really remember how many. I had some stuff plugged into me like an IV, and a red glowing elastic ring on my finger. Anyway, I later mentioned to the doctors that I saw it all. I saw them using the defibs, my parents, etc. Of course, no one really believed me and told me that I was probably dreaming and biasing my memories due to watching TV. But I know what I saw. I don't really recall what the exact cause of my hospitalization was, but I know that it started with an asthma attack, alongside with heart failure. My memories from that time are a mess, and I spent a lot of time in hospitals, and I've taken heart meds and steroids till I was in my mid-teens. I wish I knew or remembered more, but I never really had it explained to me. I just went along with all the doctors, my parents, and the medicines. While having my experience, I just recall one other thing. I remember that while I was in spectator mode, I saw a nurse handing a paper to my mom for her to sign. Later on, I asked her what she signed that night. She was like, "How do you know I signed anything? You were unconscious." It just turned out to be some insurance stuff. Also, I've had a heart defect since birth. I don't know the exact name, but it has something to do with my heart not opening or closing properly, which caused me insane stabbing pains in the heart area once in a while. They're gone now, thankfully, so I'm off meds. When I was 18 years old, I had major chest surgery due to an incident I had while being in the army. I woke after surgery only to realize I was not actually awake. I woke up to utter darkness. I could hear the voices around me talking about me praying I was going to get better, but the voices got quieter and the darkness diminished. A light started to appear. This light was no ordinary hospital light or lamp or the sun even, or anything like that. The light was so bright, yet I couldn't look away. I felt it getting closer and closer, and then I heard a voice. It was my mother's. She was talking about me, talking about how I was crying. And then I felt it. The light was right there. If I could have stuck my hand out, I could have touched it. I could feel myself sobbing over what I was seeing, but I was unable to do anything. After a couple of minutes of staring into the light, I finally found the courage to reach out to it. But when I tried to grab it, I found myself waking up in my hospital bed with everyone's eyes focused on me. Now, I'm not a religious man by any means, so I've considered the option of my dream happening due to the anesthetic, but this did not feel like a dream. It felt too real, and I still see the darkness to this day. I'm gonna have to speak for my dad here. He passed away a few years back. I actually wrote this out a while ago, but maybe this will be a relevant place for it to be. Dad was fearful in his last days. He had been to the hospital many times, and every single time he came close to death. What he remembers didn't reconcile with what most people report when having a near-death experience. He, in fact, had a lot of bad experiences. One in particular where he relived a day 3 times in a row where doctors sedated him, but he was fully aware of what was happening to him. He could hear the conversations, feel the pain, feel the choking and suffocation. When I saw him the next day, he had tears in his eyes, and he tried to communicate a question on how many days he was out. When I told him 1 day, he was confused, and it took him a while to wrap his head around it. He thought he was in hell, and that was his eternal punishment. He pondered for a long time on what he could have done to deserve that as a punishment. He didn't ever want to be in the hospital. He hated them his whole life, and that experience made him hate hospitals even more. With Dad's last trip via ambulance, he actually walked out to the ambulance, and it wasn't because of the usual shortness of breath. It was because of chest pains. During his last stay, he experienced more sedation, more hallucinations, and more disorientation. I went to visit him every single day to get an update on his status. One night in particular, they had trouble getting his heart rate down. It was steadily beating at about 160, and would calm down to 120 or so before going back up to 160. It wasn't good for him. Then, the next time he was up, I walked in right around his dinner time. He couldn't wait to talk to me, but he could barely talk. It took all of his effort and energy, but he had some things to say. From the dad's perspective, "Son, I know without a doubt that there's an afterlife." Me, "Really? How are you so sure? You've been seeing guns on the ceiling and all kinds of hallucinations." "That wasn't me. I wasn't here." "You weren't here?" "I was there." "Okay, well, did you see anyone you knew?" Dad shook his head. No, it's not like that. You can see souls being born into life, and it's the most beautiful thing you can see. Everyone has their own color, and they're trying to get to white." Me, "Trying to get to white?" Dad nods his head. "Time doesn't exist there. Time is here because of us, and we're here because of time." "Oh, I should have done more." And then he looks at his hands. "I could have been another Jimmy Page." He's referring to his skill as a guitarist. "I could have done more." Me, "But you were the greatest dad, and..." Dad just smirked a little to indicate that isn't what he meant. "Do more. Do everything you can." Me, "So, like carpe diem? Like seize the day?" "Yes, do everything you can. Don't worry about the consequences. Everyone finds their way. People worry too much about the consequences. Just do good and do as much as you can. Everyone eventually gets there. Tell the family." Me, "Can I tell everyone?" Dad, "Yes, tell everyone." "Okay, Dad, I'll tell everybody. I love you. I love you too, son." That was the last conversation that I had with him. I miss him terribly, and have been trying really hard to find myself again after his passing. It's been a long time, and I've been able to cope with it enough to finally write this all out. I really hope this finds someone that needs to hear it. Anaphylaxis. I wasn't breathing. I considered all the hallucinations I experienced likely due to a hypoxic episode until I told my mom what I saw. A middle-aged man who wasn't in scrubs standing still at the end of my bed while all staff were running around doing their business. I was having a nonverbal conversation with him, and he was telling me to calm down, focus on breathing. He wore a tropical-style button-down shirt and one of those old-school newsboys hats, and had a very pleasant demeanor. Mom showed me a photo of my grandpa that I had never seen before, and it was the guy at the foot of my bed, and he had died before I was even born. About 13 years ago, I fell into a retention pond in the middle of winter. I was wearing a downcoat, and despite being a good swimmer, I had a very hard time getting out. In fact, I barely made it out alive. I got my upper torso out of the water and fell onto the shore. From there, until waking up in the ambulance to the EMTs saying they didn't have a pulse, I don't remember. What I do remember though while I was out is I saw a bright white mixed with memories of my uncle who had died several years earlier. At this point in my life, I was searching for religion and was a pretty shitty person. After I regained consciousness and yelled, "I'm alive!" I reflected upon my life choices for several weeks. I kept going back to the experience of near death. When I arrived at the hospital that day, my body temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It took 5 hours to get my temperature back up to normal, and the doctors were surprised I was alive at all. Thinking about that and what I saw made me realize that it doesn't matter what religion I choose, I just need to be a better person. It took a few years for the self-reflection and inner thoughts to take effect, but I ultimately decided upon a philosophy of living instead of religion. I chose Taoism as a basis of my philosophy of life. A few years later, around 7 or 8 years ago, I started seeing everything around me as a basis for what others might call God. I pray, but usually to nature or to the sun, depending upon the circumstances. For me, everything is connected in some way, and it's through nature that I have life. Life I should be thankful for. Afterlife is still complicated for me. I basically believe a large number of things can happen after we pass and leave our physical body. However, I'm adamant that in some way our spirit remains, whether imprinted upon the land or in people's hearts, or both. Our body goes back to the earth, but our inner being, our true energy, or spirit, or whatever you'd like to call it, remains to give back in what ways that we can. I was dead for 6 minutes. I was laying on the gurney and I was getting colder. Somewhere my body started warming up, and everything became really calm and peaceful. I was no longer in any pain. All the noise from the ER just went away. It was actually kind of enjoyable. I was thinking about my daughter, and I was remembering all the things that we had done together. Slowly, it was just black, and then nothing. There was no knowledge of anything. I explain it like it was before I was even born. Then, the worst thing in the world is being revived. I started hearing loud noises, I felt this massive pain, and then there was the nastiest stench ever. The smell was like every dead animal in existence had crawled into my nose. The smell was so bad I started vomiting. I remember the doctors turning me on my side and watching my vomit spray on a nurse. Dying was the most pleasant thing I've ever experienced, and being revived was the worst. I'm not really sure what happened, and it still freaks me out to this day. My daughter was only 4 and developed pneumonia. Her breathing would stop in her sleep, so we took her to the emergency room. She was there for a total of 5 days. For the first 3 days, her health kept deteriorating, and on the 3rd day, my girlfriend got a call that her mother had collapsed and was taken to the hospital. She was without oxygen for 20 minutes and was declared brain dead. That night, my daughter woke up and asked about Grandma. No one had said anything to her, or while they were in the room with her. We asked her what did she mean. She told us that Grandma came to her in a dream and said, "It's not your time yet. I'll go for you instead." Immediately the next day, she was almost 100% better. My girlfriend is anaphylactic, and it's triggered by a chemical called salicylate, found in pretty much every food. When she was in high school, she had her first big reaction, and the school nurses refused to administer her EpiPen, or adrenaline shot, until the ambulance got there. Now obviously, having an anaphylactic reaction doesn't give you a lot of, quote, waiting time, so by the time the ambulance got to her school, she was in pretty bad shape and barely conscious. The paramedics immediately administered one of her EpiPens, called the nurses fucking twats, and loaded her into the ambulance as her mother arrived. She continued to fade, so they gave her a direct injection of adrenaline this time. Still nothing. They gave her a second direct injection of adrenaline. This time it hits her about 30 seconds later all at once, and her heart fails. She stops breathing, no pulse, nothing. Dead to the world. For 2 minutes and 46 seconds, she was clinically dead. And the scariest thing is, she saw nothing. She tells me that when you're losing consciousness, you can't tell the difference between waves of drowsiness and when your body actually shuts down. All she saw was the darkness of her eyelids, and it felt like going into an extremely calm sleep where she couldn't hear or feel anything, and she didn't mind it. This was all despite the fact that her mother and the paramedics were screaming at the top of their lungs for her to keep her eyes open, and the ambulance was flying towards the hospital. She miraculously just came back to life almost 3 minutes later as they were giving her chest compressions, and the cardiologist that assessed her later stated that all the adrenaline in her body was not only enough to stop her heart, but it was also enough to restart it with a little help from the paramedic pumping it around. But still to this day, she can't differentiate between falling asleep after a long day and dying. I was on loads of morphine, so it's still really hazy, and the fact that it happened almost 6 years ago doesn't help the memory, but I'll try to recollect as accurately as I can what happened and what I experienced. I had appendicitis, and my foster parents at the time didn't take me to the hospital until 2, almost 3 days after it had burst. I should have been dead well before they took me. Even the doctors called it a miracle. Well, I died while waiting for surgery. I had to wait for a pediatric surgeon to come in because no one else felt comfortable enough performing the surgery on a case this bad with a child this size. These dumbasses took me to the adult hospital, not the pediatrics, which was about 40 minutes away. I was only 14, 5'3", and weighed 75 pounds, soaking wet. So while I was waiting for the surgeon, I was in a room with me, the doctor, my 2 foster parents, and my grandmother who was an RN. Like I said, I was really drugged up, and I couldn't really focus or do anything. The monitor that I was hooked up to would beep really loudly from time to time, and the intervals between beeps started to decrease rapidly. It turns out I wasn't breathing. I was conscious for the most part, and I just kept forgetting to breathe. Doctors had to keep nudging me so I wouldn't fall asleep. I just remember being pissed at this loud beeping that kept me from enjoying a nice slumber. The doctor had to step out for a second, and my grandmother reassured him that she could look after me. Unfortunately for her, she was out of her mind with rage at my foster parents. She didn't hold anything back. My grandmother is a sweet Mormon Utah without a rude bone in her body. Well, I heard quite a few, quote, fuck yous or pieces of shit, etc. My point is that she didn't notice I had passed out until the monitor signaled I had flatlined. This is the bit where I died, and is by far the most vivid part of my experience. I remember being capable of thought, but no thoughts were in my head. I can only describe it as being conscious of my spirit, but without a body for my thoughts to be processed in. I just kind of existed without feeling, thinking, or being anything. I was just floating. Honestly, at the same time, it was a great feeling. I don't remember any visions of people, family, places, or anything like that, but I felt something wrap around me and comfort me. Without talking, I was assured that I was okay, that there was nothing to be worried about, and at that point my thoughts returned. I knew at that moment, without knowing how long I'd be able to keep thinking, that I had to go back. I didn't want to, but knowing that the last thing I had seen before I left mortal life was these 2 pieces of human trash who had abused me, neglected me, and treated me like a stain that they didn't even want to bother trying to clean up, that did it. I wanted to get back to my body, fix my fucking life so I could go back and live with my biological parents and feel loved again. In that moment, that's all I cared about. And then I sort of willed myself back. Doctors had tried to resuscitate me but had failed. Everyone was shocked that I opened my eyes. Seeing the tears in my grandmother's eyes after thinking she had lost me, that did it for me. I fixed my life. I reinvented myself, and I threw out all of the anger, depression, rage, and everything else that my foster parents had put into me. Honestly, the only anger I feel anymore is when I think about them and how they're still fostering youth in custody and probably pulling the same shit with those kids. I live about an hour away from where they are now, and I have to restrain myself from driving up there, kidnapping those kids, and taking them to the authorities with an explanation of why. The only reason I haven't done that is because I've tried telling the authorities what kind of people they are, and I guess the words of a juvenile fuck-up don't stack up against the lies from people who have practiced this shit for years. Anyway, sorry for the rant at the end. I know that wasn't entirely what you asked for, but it felt good to type it out. It's been surprisingly therapeutic to talk about this. So, this is secondhand from my dad, but he was always a little shaken up when he told me this story. Years before I came along, my dad was cruising around on his motorcycle when a little dog ran into the road straight at him, barking. He swerved so that he wouldn't hit the poor little pupper, and a car in the opposite traffic did as well. My dad got clipped and thrown off his bike. It was on a hill, so he slid pretty far until his body hit a parked car. Now the weird part. He always got this sort of haunted look when he talked about it, which wasn't very often. He says that he remembers plain as day standing at the bottom of the street on the corner watching as a man got hit off of his bike and tumbled through the air and down the hill. He says that he remembers thinking, that guy is definitely going to die. He woke up the next day in the hospital with a nurse picking gravel out of his back. He's had reconstruction surgery on his hand and his arm, which consist mostly of metal pins now. Remember, if on a motorcycle, always wear your leathers and helmet. Without them, my dad would have been dead for sure, and I wouldn't be around. I don't share it much, but I've had 4 heart surgeries, and in my first and third one, I coded. You had to be conscious for these surgeries to get your heart to react appropriately. The first time, it was just nothingness. Black, just nothing. I can't even explain how long it was like nothingness. And then, I remember waking up with one of them over me saying, "We lost you for a second there. Are you okay?" The second time is the hard one to share. I woke up in a type of subway feeling like everything was white. Within the subway, the tunnel walls we were just speeding through. I didn't have a body per se. It even felt like I was the subway at times. And then at other times it felt like I was just looking out the window at the tunnel wall. It came to a stop, and it was just black nothingness again. And then I heard a voice of a much older man. He said, "Are you ready to go?" And I just said nothing, like I didn't know how to speak. "We're going now if you're ready." And something inside of me felt so ready to go, like I was a magnet to it, this unknown destination in the black nothingness ahead. I remember finally saying, "Okay." He said another time with a slightly different tone, "We'll be leaving here. You are ready to go?" And finally, something in me snapped, and I remembered that I had a life and people I'd leave behind, and my first thought was, I can't leave my girlfriend. I couldn't do that. And my mom and dad, my puppies, I can't leave any of them. My family, my friends. Once I had decided I couldn't leave, and I was for sure staying, I woke up and came to consciousness with the medical team all around me.